Guano day, guano day, guano day, guano danahi. Guanalia, guano danahi. Guanalia, guano danahi. Guanalia, guano day. Guanalia, guano day. Guanalia, guano da. Hey. Neen gadlanan malta. Medawalain, ach, weligiskok. Hello, my name is Catherine Martin. I'd like to welcome you on this beautiful day to the land of the Mi'kmaq, to the land of my ancestors for over 14,000 years. And in keeping with the tradition of my ancestors, I'm honored to welcome you back to our campus, back to our territory, and welcome all the newcomers to come and be part of our beautiful land that we have enjoyed for so many years. Guanalia, guanodanahi. Guanalia, guanodanahi. Guanalia, guanode. Guanalia, guanode. Guanalia, guanoda. Daho.
Good evening. I would like to thank Catherine Martin, our Director for Indigenous Community Engagement, for providing that inspirational recording of a Mi'kmaq welcome. I am Teresa Rajak-Talley, the Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion at Dalhousie University. I would like to acknowledge that Dalhousie University is situated in Chibuktu, Halifax, the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation, who have been here for thousands of years. We recognize that we are all beneficiaries of the Peace and Friendship Treaty, understand what this means, and pay respect to our elders. The Office of the Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion also acknowledges the history, contributions, and legacies of the African Nova Scotian people who have been here for over 400 years and pay our respect to the elders. It is within this context that I would like to take a moment on behalf of Dalhousie's President, Deep Saini, Provost Frank Harvey, the Speak Truth to Power Forum team, the Speak Truth to Power Forum team, and all the faculty, staff, and students to acknowledge one of Nova Scotia's great, Wanda Robeson, the youngest sister of the late civil rights pioneer, Viola Desmond, and an activist in her own right. Wanda died over the weekend at the age of 95. Our hearts and condolences go out to her family, friends, and community. It is in her spirit that her sister, the Dalhousie, continues to host the Viola Desmond Lecture Series and this forum as they both spoke truth to power. Welcome to the 9th episode in our Speak Truth to Power series, sounding the alarm on gender-based violence. Gender-based violence can take many forms, including physical, verbal, digital, sexual, emotional, psychological abuse, threats, coercion, economic and educational deprivation. This forum will provide an avenue where many voices can be heard as we discuss the issues, experiences, and what is needed in our society, communities, and institutions to help eliminate gender-based violence and ensure support and resources are available to those in need. We were originally scheduled to host this episode last year during the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, an annual international campaign that kicks off on 25th of November, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and runs to December 10th, Human Rights Day. However, due to some COVID challenges, we had to reschedule, but we were determined to host this forum because although there are 16 days dedicated to activism against gender-based violence, we believe that every day should be dedicated to ending all gender-based violence. This forum tonight allows us to add our voices to those around the world who are actively seeking and working every day to achieve this goal. This month is also significant as February is recognized nationally as Black History Month to honor the legacy of Black Canadians and their communities. In Nova Scotia, the month of celebration and reflection has been known as African Heritage Month since 1996, and this year's provincial theme is Through Our Eyes, the Voices of African Nova Scotians. While the Speak Truth to Power Forum acknowledges and celebrates the African Nova Scotians' contribution and legacies, we believe in centering the voices and the experiences of the African Nova Scotian community on every episode, and has done so on every topic so far. This month and today's forum is no exception, as our conversation is inclusive of the voices of the African Nova Scotians on a social issue that affects us all. There is no one group or 1 month or 1 year where gender-based violence does not occur. We also chose the theme of sounding the alarm as the COVID pandemic has resulted in an alarming increase in the already existing pandemic of gender-based violence in our communities, as our members of our esteemed panelists will discuss with us tonight. But I would like to begin by sharing some alarming data on the global breadth and depth of gender-based violence. The latest estimate shows that nearly 1 in 3 women aged 15 years and older around the world have been subjected to physical or sexual abuse by an intimate partner, a non-partner, or both at least once in their lifetime. This tells us that levels of gender-based violence have remained largely unchanged over the last decade. These numbers do not reflect the impact of the COVID pandemic and would be even higher if they were included. It is a fact that COVID has exacerbated all risk factors for gender-based violence, including unemployment and poverty, and has reinforced many of the root causes such as gender stereotypes and harmful social norms. It has also been estimated that 11 million girls may not return to school because of COVID. The economic fallout is expected to push 47 million more women and girls into extreme poverty. Dear colleagues, friends, and community, the COVID pandemic has reversed decades of progress and further perpetuates structural inequalities that reinforce gender-based violence. In addition, the pandemic continues to demonstrate that the world is unprepared to respond to the rapid escalation of all forms of gender-based violence. While the forms and contexts may differ across geographic location, gender-based violence is universally experienced in different forms in public and private settings. The most marginalized, including women, people with disabilities, transgender populations, refugees, Indigenous people, among others, are at disproportionate risk and face greater barriers in accessing services and justice. That said, like you, I'm eager to hear our panelists tonight as they talk about gender-based violence here at home. Tonight, I also have the pleasure of having Dr. Barbara Hamilton Hinch, fondly known by everyone, and I mean everyone, as Barbs. Dr. Barbara Hamilton Hinch is an associate professor at Dalhousie University in the School of Health and Human Performance. She is the inaugural Assistant Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion, doing wonderful transformative EDI work with us. As a scholar, a proud African Nova Scotian, and a social activist, Dr. Hamilton Hinch is passionate about working towards improving the health outcomes and overall well-being of people of African descent. I am proud and honored to have her as a colleague, a friend, a sister, and my co-host tonight. But before I pass the verbal talking stick on, there are a few housekeeping notes. 1. We will be inviting our guest speakers to join in accordance with the program, as you saw on the slide. Everyone's cameras and microphones have been turned off to ensure that only our guests are on the screen. The chat feature has been disabled, but attendees can place their questions in the Q&A channel. We did receive some questions prior, and we will try to group the questions so we can get to as many as we can. So thank you for understanding. You can get closed captioning by clicking the 3 dots at the top of your screen and choosing the CC icon. As this is a virtual event, we may experience technical difficulties, including people forgetting to turn their mics on. We appreciate your patience if this may occur. This event is live streamed and recorded as an educational tool for future reference. You can check the HRES website for the link as soon as it is ready. So with those few words, I now pass on the virtual talking stick to Dr. Barbara Hamilton Hinch.
Thank you, Teresa. It's a very warm welcome. I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce all of our panelists this morning, or this evening. And our first panelist I'm going to introduce is Lisa Lachance. And as I introduce them, this will also be the order that they'll be speaking in. So Lisa Lachance is the MLA for Halifax Citadel-Sable Island. They are the NDP caucus spokesperson for the 2S LGBTQ+ affairs. The New Affairs, Mental Health and Addictions, Agricultural, Acadian Affairs, Advanced Education, Communications Nova Scotia, and Finance. That's a long list, Lisa. Lisa was first elected to the House of Assembly in 2021. Having founded consulting firm Wisdom to Action and led its transition from government supported network to independent social enterprise, Lisa has a long-standing track record as a prolific community engager. She started her career in the public sector, advocating for the rights of children and youth at an international level. Lisa is believed to be the first genderqueer MLA elected to the Nova Scotia House of Assembly and uses both they, them, and she, her pronouns. Lisa and partner Heather were one of the first couples married in Canada upon the legislation of same-sex marriage in 2003. They have 2 children, Jason, 18, and Kara, 15, and are long-time residents of Halifax, Kijiptu. Lisa holds a BA with honors in International Development Studies and a Master's of Public Administration, both from Dalhousie University. She is still a student of Dalhousie, completing her PhD in Health on integrating community into youth-centered mental health planning. Lisa's constituency is located in Mi'kmaq, the unceded ancestral territory of the Lenni people. Welcome, Lisa. Our next speaker will be Crystal John. Crystal John is a social worker with a passion for community development. Crystal is a passionate advocate for women's empowerment and is a trained birth and postpartum doula for over 30 years. Crystal has supported women and family in childbirth choices. Crystal earned her Bachelor of Social Work and a Master's of Social Work degree from Dalhousie University. Currently, she's employed as a social work coordinator at Absent House for Women and Children. Crystal has worked in areas of gendered and sexualized violence research, adult and parenting education, housing and Afrocentric interventions, which included counseling, parenting support, resource, and service advocacy. Welcome, Crystal. Next, we'll have Lyndsay Anderson. Lyndsay Anderson is a sexualized violence advisor for the Human Rights and Equity Services at Dalhousie University. She has spent her career working in student affairs on various campuses in Nova Scotia, including St. FX, Dalhousie, and St. Mary's University. Lyndsay has extensive experience with student conduct and accountability, which includes developing a restorative justice program for students causing harm in the Halifax community, reviving student behavior policies, investigating sexualized violence cases, and facilitating educational sessions as well as workshops on sexualized violence, as well as consent and bystander intervention. Lyndsay holds a BA in criminology from the University of Toronto and an MA in Women and Gender Studies from Mount St. Vincent University and St. Mary's University, with a research topic of rape culture and sexualization discourse on university campuses. Lyndsay's recent publications include a co-authored article in the journal Girlhood Studies, examining media discourse of the St. Mary's rape chant, a co-authored toolkit for working with those who cause gender-based harms with the Courage to Act project, a national framework to address gender-based violence on post-secondary campuses, and a co-authored chapter in Conduct and Community, a Residence Life Practitioner's Guide. Lyndsay spends her time teaching fitness classes, playing and coaching roller derby with Anchor City Rollers in Halifax, and spending time with her family and her trio of adopted Chihuahuas. And our final speaker this evening will be Suzie Dunn. Sorry, Suzie. Suzie Dunn is an assistant professor at Dalhousie School of Law. Her research centers on the intersections of equality, technology, and the law, with a specific focus on technology-facilitated violence, deepfakes, and impersonation in digital spaces. She currently sits on the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund's Technology Facilitated Violence Project Committee. She's an associate member of the Center for Law, Technology, and Society and is a senior fellow with the Center for International Governance Innovation. So I hope that you are joining me as we welcome these amazing speakers this evening to this panel, and looking forward to great discussion after they present. And I encourage you to use the Q&A function as they speak, load up some great questions to create a great discussion after the presentation. So our first speaker will be Lisa. You have the mic, Lisa. I'm passing the talking stick to you.
Great, thank you so much. So I was realizing as Barb was going through my bio that really what I'm going to talk a bit about today is actually going to sort of take us through a bit of that path in my life. So from the point of Wisdom to Action, which actually started as a federally funded knowledge network based at Dalhousie, to work that the organization is now doing as a social enterprise, and then to my role in the legislature. And I plan to have a particular focus on street harassment and public harassment, and as particularly experienced by 2S LGBTQ plus populations and women as well. I do have slides. I don't know if they're gonna pop up. Here they come. We can go to the second slide. And so just on the second slide, there's just a bit of background information in terms of you know, kind of where sort of the social exclusion, inequality, oppression sort of finds itself located, and how it bears out in the lives of 2S LGBTQ plus folks. And so, you know, it's economic, it's, you know, which is also around housing, sexual harassment. You know, I think there's a large number of trans folks in particular, who avoid public places because of fear of violence. And, you know, looking at, you know, long-term outcomes in terms of increased suicidality, mental health, and substance misuse. So I think probably a lot of the folks attending this session are familiar with a lot of that context, but I just thought I would put that up there. So we can go to the next slide. So when Wisdom to Action was federally funded, we were asked on behalf of the Public Health Agency of Canada to better understand the experience of 2S LGBTQ plus youth with gender-based violence. And I will say this is probably one of my favorite, not in the sense of, you know, it would be great if we don't have to do these sessions and this research, but a great project in terms of it was youth led, so everyone from our project coordinator, who was a youth trans person out of Ottawa, to a youth advisory council that helped develop all the materials. We had youth led sessions in cities across Canada, and we also had youth led analysis. So once we had all those sessions, we actually kept meeting online with folks from across the country to really understand what we were hearing. And, you know, and I think it confirmed a little bit, you know, what we unfortunately sort of anticipated hearing, but, you know, that there is still, you know, a lot of lack of safety in families, that schools were still not a safe place, and that services were not always a safe place as well. And then also about the particular impact of unsafe streets, so that experience of public or street level harassment. And so, you know, I think with so many, you know, equity deserving communities and our fights, you know, we of course, things have gotten better in terms of, you know, the lives of young people being able to come out, but that doesn't mean that actually the everyday realities of 2S LGBTQ plus young people are are without serious need to consider the impact of gender-based violence. And we can go to the next slide. And we'll just quickly pass by here. So this information is still available. The Youth Advisory Council wrote a video script to talk about the findings. And then obviously we had a report and executive summary. We can keep on going. And I think because we were so impacted by this project, and we had so many young people come out to share their experience with us, we really wanted to find a way to keep this project rolling and keep the information rolling and to move towards action. And like so many government grants, the Public Health Agency of Canada didn't actually have any implementation funding. So we kept looking for various different ways to talk about this work and talk about these issues, much like I'm doing now. And then actually in 2021, just before I ran in the election campaign, we actually had funding confirmed for 3 years from Women and Gender Equality at the federal level. And we're thrilled because this is allowing us to really lead for 3 years a comprehensive national initiative called SAFER that will focus on training for 2S LGBTQ plus organizations and youth serving organizations about better supporting 2S LGBTQ plus youth and when they experience gender violence. We also will be running public education campaigns, and particularly around street and public harassment, which I think is a really important piece. And hopefully we'll get into this in the discussion. But I just think about the fact that, if young people, like there's still a good proportion of young people who don't feel safe in their homes. And if they're not safe on the streets, sort of where does that leave them? How does that, show up in terms of accessing school, employment services? I think, this is a particular area that can really point us towards areas for change. We can go to the next slide. And then I was like, well, how do I bring this forward? And so I think that we are at a particular time where when people, young 2S LGBTQ plus folks aren't safe on the street. So this photo is from this past week in Ottawa as part of the occupation that's happening. On the front of it, the occupation is not actually talking about sexual orientation and gender identity, but it opens up a whole bunch of space where people can come and serve and I guess raise transphobic and homophobic remarks. And anyone who knows Ottawa, this is actually kind of a heartbreaking photo for me because, we lived in Ottawa for a number of years, and this is the canal. So this is where you would go with your kids and get your skates on, and the beaver tail stand is right there, and you see someone skating off to the left. And this is, sort of the really the co-opting of public space that's supposed to be available for safety and for recreation. And there's been lots of other reports in Ottawa, just countless reports actually, and friends who have been harassed on the street, who've been called all the names. If we can just go forward another slide. There is a cafe that is known as a safe space, and you can see the rainbow flag in the window, and it had its window smashed overnight a couple of nights ago. There was nothing actually, sort of left to say that why those windows were smashed, but based on the amount of harassment that folks have been experiencing in their daily lives in Ottawa, we might presume it had something to do with the rainbow flag. And I think too, we have to think about how, if we're in this heightened period of public discontent and protest in the ways that we're seeing, like how this actually will impact our young people now and in the short term. So if we can go to the next slide. So this wasn't about transphobia, homophobia, but this is what happened in Halifax on Sunday. So there was, as many of you know, there was a a convoy that went through the town. There were a number of people who sort of went to counter protest. And so this person posted on Twitter, you know, about her experience with her mom. And again, you know, very gendered language, very like the threat was being given because of gender. And so again, how does this affect how we can go out into the streets and be activists and be part of the conversation? And we can keep going. And so, you know, so then I was like, well, and how is an MLA, how, you know, where do we see this coming up? And I think there's a real need to be thinking about, you know, as we all do, but to really, how can we address issues around gender-based violence in a number of the key policy areas that the provincial government needs to advance on in the next little while. So you know, from here to 2030, we have really huge commitments around accessibility in this province. And how are we considering gender-based violence in those, and how are we considering the needs of 2S LGBTQ plus folks when we're creating spaces that are accessible by one definition, but making sure that we actually take an intersectional approach to thinking about safe and accessible public spaces and government services and that sort of thing. And I'm wondering if someone can just give me a time check, because I might have lost track of how long Okay, I'm going to keep going, but then someone maybe can put it in our speaker chat. I mean, another piece, I'm going to pop down to the bottom of this list, the active transportation strategy. So the province is currently developing an active transportation strategy, and the desire to get more folks out walking and cycling and, you know, rollerblading and having, you know, different ways of getting around. And while there will be a focus on culture change, the question is what kind of culture change, and that there's actually a real need to think about. So you can't just tell everybody to go out and walk and bike equally, but the experience of folks is different based on their gender identity, their sexual orientation, their gender expression, and their levels of safety. So if we're talking about culture change, it's not just about like people really getting into their bikes, it's also about calling out gender-based violence as an experience that people have on our streets and in our communities. We can keep on going. And, you know, I think there are some upcoming pieces of legislation that we can expect in the spring session of the legislature. So this is kind of my call to action for folks who are, you know, interested in gender-based violence and want to be addressing it across, you know, across different areas. So we're not quite sure, but there'll be some sort of poverty reduction or child poverty reduction bill coming forward from the government. Again, making sure that the, you know, the proposals that are contained in that legislation, or, you know, likely also in a strategy to implement it, consider issues around gender-based violence and poverty, and also specifically talk about the, you know, the effect of unsafe homes and unsafe streets on poverty for 2S LGBTQ plus folks. The Premier has committed to an anti-racism and anti-hate bill, and again, you know, keeping an eye out for making sure that we're not just addressing by population or by experience, but also those interconnected types of experiences. The creation of a Child and Youth Commission, and even Mi'kmaq is a traditional language of Nova Scotia. So how can that be used to address gender-based violence that we experience in this province? And we're planning to bring something forward around gender-affirming care. So as well, hopefully that's intersectional and comprehensive. But if it's not, we need advocates out there reading it for us and making sure that we're making the changes that we need. So, and I think I have a couple more slides that we might go through. If you can skip the next one. There, we'll stop here. So I really just, I mean, I guess a call to action. So I'm a relatively new MLA. I don't think I used my MLAs enough before I was elected, to be quite honest. And so when things are happening, like really to be in touch with us, because, we have two roles. One is the political role, and that's where we get to go talk about bills and, some examples here, we get to make member statements and private members' bills and that sort of thing. But also as a constituency MLA, I mean, that's a role to support the well-being of a community. And so that's also a really important role. And the more we know what's happening in terms of any issue, but in this case, gender-based violence, the more that we can support individuals, yes, access to services that they need, but then we also as a caucus can talk about this information. We know what the trends are that are happening, and then we can go talk about it in the House. So just to say, I just really encourage people to think about your MLAs, looking at things like showing up a law amendments committee. Once we start going through, we have a very important budget. I'm calling it the VIB this year. So again, just staying engaged in these issues. And then just a little pitch for some of the things that we're doing in Halifax, Citadel-Sable Island. I have an ongoing provincial, province-wide 2S LGBTQ+ forum. We're meeting about every 2 weeks and really bringing a lot of policy and program proposals forward that different organizations are leading. I have a youth advisory council. We're doing some work on accessibility and disability, and also small businesses. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Lisa. That was absolutely full of lots of information, and I'm very glad that I have the pleasure to be working with you on a project at Dal. And so I'm looking forward to our conversation as we progress through this evening. I now pass the talking stick over to Crystal.
Thank you, Barb. So thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. As a social worker working in Halifax, this is a topic that has been close to my heart for many years. As a doula, one of the ways that I feel like I contribute to preventing some of that is really protecting women in their choices as they, decide and make decisions about how they choose to bring their children into the world. And often we know that in our medical system, there are specifics that people are looking for. There's always this idea of moving forward, and we have an agenda, so we're going to give you medication, we're going to do this to move this birth along. And so that's one of the ways that I feel like I have an opportunity to empower women, is to let them know that they actually have a choice, that they can decide whether they want to have medication, they can decide who's going to be present at their birth. They can make those decisions. And so I really feel, that's one of those things that I consistently have done over, as Barb said, the last 30 years in really helping women do that. I think about, misogyny, gender, and intimate partner violence against women. It is ugly, and it's an ongoing issue in our society. As we saw earlier, the statistics have not changed over 10 years. And for me, that's a frightening and should really call us all to be alarmed. And it continues to result in the senseless deaths of thousands of women annually. And just to bring that close to home, that's 160 women last year in Canada who lost their lives. So that's 1 year in the middle of a pandemic. And those, we know that those are the women who died. We don't know, we think about how it is hidden in a pandemic. These women were forced to live in a home where every day part of their survival was getting up, going to work, taking care of their children, going to school. And so when that stopped, a lot of women found themselves trapped in a home where they just are not safe. And again, it is a pandemic, and a lot of the times these women have lost their lives simply because they refused the advances, requests, and the orders of men. As we continue our efforts to bring awareness to this horrific, troubling problem, in hopes of bringing it to an end, I wanted to start by just reading the names of just 12 women who were killed for just saying no. And these are Black women who said no. Tiara Poya, Janice Talton Jackson, Cherika Adams, Jessica Hampton, Mary Spears, Nokuthla Fashe, Cassandra Perkins, Nova Henry, Lavina Johnson, April Jace, and Julia Martin. And I wanted to begin with the naming of Black women who've been murdered by their intimate partners, because this is a tragic and unacceptable reminder of how Black women's experiences with intimate partner violence have a deadly consequences. And that really goes unaddressed by our social systems. Each year, thousands of Black women are shot, stabbed, stalked, brutalized, and murders and crimes that never make it to the national radar. Black women's experiences with intimate partner violence and domestic violence, they experience it at a rate of 35% higher than do white women. They are also more likely than whites to be teen dating violence victims as well. And while intimate partner violence is a leading cause of death for Black women, they are seldom viewed as proper victims and are rarely cast as total innocents. In the media, instead of coming to the defense, they look for stories that paint a picture that the Black woman somehow did something to provoke the violence. We see this in the way Black women are described as aggressive or loud. I want to remind you, though, that indeed these are leaders who are demonstrating confidence, strength, and resiliency. The United Nations 1993 Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women's definition is any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of acts of coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private. The disproportionate impact that this family violence has on women and girls should ring alarms, and yet there is often silence. There's also another alarming thing is that there is a rising increase in the rate of incarceration from Black women who are Black women and Indigenous women in our communities. Often women are incarcerated at incredible rates. And the reality is that Black women are 3 times more likely than white women to be tried, convicted, and incarcerated for felony offenses when it results from intimate partner violence. There is a prevalence of Black women being criminalized when they defend themselves. And so the message we send is your strength and resiliency is wrong. There is no safety for Black women. We have a history of systemic racism which sees women of color as undeserving, and the criminal justice system is known to be unresponsive to the needs of survivors of domestic and family abuse. And it is also disproportionately tougher towards members of racialized communities. This has a profound impact on the intergenerational and historic trauma and loss in the African Nova Scotian communities, and it shows up in many other areas of our lives. The intersectionality of education, healthcare, and race can create almost a normalization of family violence. Therefore, we need to break the cycles of abuse because it has such an impact on all other aspects of our lives. We know finances, both personal and societal. A recent Justice Canada study estimated that the cost of one type of intimate partner violence, spousal violence is what they call it, on Canadian society at $7.4 billion. And that was in 2009. Most of these costs were related to victim costs, such as pain and suffering, counseling expenses, and legal fees for a divorce, while the next highest costs were borne by third parties, so families, employers, social services, and the criminal and civil justice system. Most of these services are not designed to consider the cultural needs of Black women, children, and families. And so what happens is, although, we see these statistics, I want to mention one area that, I can go and I can pull up a lot of statistics on domestic and gender-based violence as a whole. Race-based data is still not being implemented in our healthcare systems, it is in our education system. However, that's a negative impact. So that's another area that we really need to sound the alarm on and start to make inroads in terms of getting that information out there and making sure that we are including African, Nova Scotian, and Canadian Blacks in our data so that we then can figure out ways to help them overcome. So I work in homelessness, and this has shown me that the risk of lethality increases when Black women are homeless. The barriers they encounter make this even more deadly, an even more deadly combination. And we need to do more to ensure that families are surrounded with care while they are living with violence. In homelessness, one of the reasons that we may not see the numbers increased as much because of the shame from society. A lot of Black women will parcel out their children, so to speak. So before they become homeless, they will ensure their children are taken care of by their aunts and by their uncles and grandparents, and so that they are the only one experiencing the homelessness. And then they will couch surf for months on end. So it's really hidden. When I think about homelessness, I work there, and the numbers that I see and the numbers that are recorded are very different. So how do we develop promising practices responding to the lack of culturally competent services and enhanced care for African, Nova Scotian, and Black women and gender expansive folks as well, who have experienced violence at the hands of intimate partner violence? The possibility of a program like creating communities of care or more programs like that. And this is a project that is designed to address the unique and ongoing needs of African and Black women in the communities. And it was designed to, with community in mind, so that it's not just something that we choose, but we want women to tell us what they need. These underlying issues have the cumulative effect of weaving a profoundly alienating environment for women from African Nova Scotian communities who've experienced violence. It is important to ensure survivors are consulted to meet their needs. Black women emphasize their reluctance to access mainstream services for women in their position, recounting how they have been subject to racist remarks and practices by staff and residents when forced to use these services. They repeated that they felt unwelcome and unheard of in these spaces, which they saw as being designed by privileged women who do not understand their plight. In this environment, with systemic community and familial impacts, a lack of reliable and consistent services and supports shows a significant gap that we are missing in terms of reaching Black and African Nova Scotian women who are enduring this. The main objective of the project was to step into the gap and help to fill that gap and enable community-based organizations which hold cultural competence and operate through a critical race analysis lens and are already closely involved in the lives of their survivors. To implement programs and practices is a considered and well-mannered way while considering the cultural worldview and context of the communities that we serve. We often think about domestic and intimate partner violence as a woman's problem. This thinking has done nothing to shift the way society addresses the problem. It's done nothing to change the statistics on the problem. If we look at this from the perspective of a male problem, which is what I try to do, we can begin to address the aggressive and traumatic ways that men enact violence on women and the reasons why they enact violence on women. I can think of two groups that are doing this in a very small way, but really making an impact. One of those is the People's Clinic. They're doing groundbreaking work in men's health and addressing trauma through group work, and as individuals, they're doing counseling. And the other work that was begun is by the Nova Scotia Brotherhood, and their targeted programs which dig deep into the lives of Black men. So they have this one program where they did a barber shop talk. Men went, they got their hair cut, and they talked about their feelings. They talked about the issues that concern them, the things that keep them held back, the anger that they feel towards a system that is unfair, unjust, and racist. And so, my call to action is that we need to seek to fund more of these Black-led men's leadership groups so that we can then heal some of the pain men are feeling so that they're not enacting that violence back on women. The COVID pandemic has shown us that we need to engage so much more. We have spent the last 2 years, I feel like I've survived something in the last 2 years, but we have spent the last 2 years at home. And for some of us, home is a really safe, warm, and comfortable place. But for a lot of women and children, it is an unsafe, trauma-filled space. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. If these two presenters don't have you thinking about some questions to ask, then I don't know if you're watching our presentation this evening. I know that I have lots of questions that I want to put into the chat, so I'm hoping that you're having some questions that are popping up into your mind, and if so, please do put them into our question and answer. And I also seem to have a personal relationship with most of the people on the panel, so thank you, Crystal, for that presentation, and I now turn it over to Lyndsay. I'm passing the stick to you.
Thank you so much, Barb, and thanks to everyone who's spoken so far. That's, lots to think about. So good evening, and thank you to everyone for joining in this important conversation tonight. And thank you to the organizers for making this happen. My plan is to share a few thoughts on what I think are a few of the key issues or tensions that exist when addressing sexualized violence on university campuses or post-secondary campuses. Before I do, I think it's really important that you know a little bit about me. You heard a bit in my bio. My name is Lyndsay. I'm a settler in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded land of the Mi'kmaq. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that we cannot participate in anti-violence and trauma work without recognizing the role of colonialism in creating and causing violence. And Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people are disproportionately affected by sexualized violence, and the link between stolen land, consent, missing and murdered women, and Two-Spirit people cannot be ignored. So I believe that recognizing the violence of ongoing colonialism and engaging in anti-colonial actions is critical to my work, to our work on campus, if we're truly to stand as anti-violence advocates. So I work at DAL as a sexualized violence advisor, a position that I'm quite proud and privileged to be able to hold. I've spent over 20 years on university campuses. Some of those have been as a student myself. I've worked at DAL for over 10 years. I took a little time away and have recently returned in the fall. I'm a lifelong learner, so I think it's a great place for me to be, to continue that learning. As was mentioned in my bio, during non-pandemic times, I play roller derby, and I will talk about it way too much if you ask me about it. I do love roller skating, and I do love my 3 chihuahuas. which I'll also talk a lot about if you ask me. So I started my career working in residence. So after living on campus for all 5 of my undergraduate years as a student in Toronto, I moved from Toronto to Antigonish to work at St. FX as a residence life coordinator. And as a full-time live-in, young, new professional, I was assigned to live in an all-male residence, which at that time functioned really similarly to a fraternity house. We don't have a lot of fraternity and sorority houses in Canada, not like the US does, but St. FX, there was some equivalence there. I saw and heard things that still shake me to my core when I worked there. I experienced myself sexual harassment. I witnessed and responded to many incidents of sexualized violence. And what was described to me as sort of an active campus culture, or often described by Maclean's as like the best party culture, was immensely problematic. I once watched a very senior administrator, maybe the most senior administrator, enter residence at midnight to attend a G.I. Joe's and Army Hose theme party. And when I expressed my concern about that and sort of the message that it would send, I was told that I didn't understand because I was a CFA. And for those who've heard that phrase before, that's a come from away. I didn't understand the culture. When I spoke up about rape culture, which we weren't really calling it that back then, we weren't really naming it as such back then, but I was speaking up about incidents of rape culture, I was shut down, and a short time later I wasn't offered a renewal of a contract and ended up leaving the university and leaving the town. I still have very mixed feelings about my time at St. FX, but I do share all this for 2 reasons. One, because I am super hopeful about the amount of change that I have seen in the past 10 to 15 years since my time there and working as a new professional on campus. And I know they've come a long way from when I was there. And they certainly weren't the only ones dealing with these types of issues, although maybe with the exception of the senior administrator. That was pretty unique. But the issues around rape culture were not unique to that campus. I also share this experience because it led me to pursue more education, and it really shaped my career path. So I applied for and completed my master's in women and gender studies. I should mention that I was a first-generation student. I was the first person in my family to ever go to university, period. But to go and get my master's was also a pretty big deal. I ended up doing research on discourses of rape culture on campus. And as we all know, there was sadly a lot of examples for me to be drawing upon. But I also share this story because I have hope, as I mentioned. I hope because I've seen so many survivors, activists, students, community members who've brought these issues into the light. They've named these issues. They've shared their stories. They've challenged institutions. They've raised their hands and they've said, me too. So 15 years ago, I was trying to convince people that sexualized violence and rape culture was a thing, that it was happening on campus, it was a problem to be addressed. And now I feel like this awareness exists and we're seeing so much more nuanced conversations happening about what to do about it, how best to do it, and who needs to be included in order to do this work and do it well. And despite always suffering from immense imposter syndrome, I am proud to be part of this work and part of the movement. So I want to speak briefly about consent. Folks may remember that animated video that came out several years ago that said consent was like a cup of tea. And it analogized that if you could understand that you can't make someone tea and force them to drink it, that you could understand sexual consent. It was fun, it was clear, it was simple, and frankly, it was a resource that we desperately needed at that time. It got us talking in clear terms about the importance of sexual consent. So the video stated right at its outset that consent is simple as tea. And as a tea drinker and a consent educator, I still appreciate this video. But as a practitioner who's heard hundreds of disclosures and reports of sexualized violence, I know that it's not this simple for everyone. And I think that many people understand the basics of what that video was trying to say now, but we're still plagued with rape myths and stereotypes that misdirect our attention and complicate our understandings of consent. So this video didn't get into at all the dynamics of power and coercion, which is something that I see so much in many of the incidents of sexualized violence. The video doesn't dig into issues of intersectionality and multiple identities and how they can influence or cause people to be more at risk of sexualized violence. And I think it's important to remember when we think about power and coercion, that it's not just by the person who's a stranger, as we often hear that sexual assaults are completed by the stranger. It's not just by the boss or the professor. Power and coercion can exist by the friend or the family member or the intimate partner. And I think we need to be willing to have more conversations about this complicated aspect of consent and teasing out how to recognize and address these power dynamics and how to hold those who have power accountable for their actions. Another challenge that I'm struggling with has to do with the disconnect between consent education and how the criminal justice system views consent and responds to sexualized violence. So we teach that consent is freely given, it's clear, it's informed, it can be withdrawn at any time, it can't exist if someone's incapacitated, etc. But when we hear about a case like what took place at St. FX, where 2 football players were accused of sexually assaulting a woman in residence, and I apologize for picking another example about St. FX, it's just a good one that illuminates the point I'm trying to make. Obviously, Dal has its own share of issues and cases too, and I choose, these other examples, but if you ever wanted to talk about, say, rape culture, and, I have lots of examples from Dal and beyond, so just give me a call. But in this case, which was tried in Antigonish, the judge relied on testimony from an RA, a residence assistant, who had checked on the survivor earlier in the night. And the judge relied on the RA because they were a sober and reliable witness. The judge said that the RA testified in a straightforward manner about how she talked with the complainant earlier in the night and said she did not appear to be in any distress. The judge contrasted the survivor's description of her own state of mind that night with descriptions from other witnesses who said she was smiling and laughing. So why is it that a survivor smiling and laughing, either before or after an incident or an assault, would provide any indication of whether they consented to the act in question? I understand that courts need to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, and I'm not trying to change that. But I do think we need to acknowledge that what we know or teach, what we are trying to teach about consent does not fit in the criminal justice system at this time. So why do we so often default to these systems to address or solve this type of crime when they demonstrate time and time again how incompatible they are? So universities are obviously not off the hook on this one either. And I'm really tired of being asked how we are addressing situations that are he said, she said, because how could we possibly know what's happened in a room between 2 people? And I really don't like that expression. It's like one that I'm tired of hearing. The reality is, as someone who used to investigate sexualized violence cases, I can tell you that there's immense value in requiring a person to sit down and explain how it is that they had consent in a situation. That explanation is illuminating. Many times when it is explained, it becomes clear that consent either wasn't there or the person doesn't actually know what consent is. I've had many people acknowledge by describing what happened that they didn't have consent when in fact they thought they did. What we need to know, or what we need to think about with our systems that respond to these incidents, we need to have systems that allow for conversations about consent to take place. And more meaningfully. And then we can start to look at accountability. How do we hold folks accountable who truly don't understand what consent is or that willfully choose not to get consent? Another key tension in sexualized violence response has to do with the importance of being survivor-centered, but how this can sometimes be in conflict with accountability to our community. So when a survivor comes forward to seek resources or support, but they have no interest in reporting the incident, which happens fairly frequently, it can sometimes look to others like we're not holding a perpetrator accountable or that we just aren't doing anything about it. We can't force a survivor to engage in a process that they don't want to. It can be extremely re-traumatizing. But when these incidents take place in communities, as they do, especially ones that are small or tight-knit, where everybody knows each other or where people might be aware of what happened, there are often these calls to act and hold a person accountable, and especially in these real carceral and punitive ways. We have to critically examine how we balance the needs of the survivors, which are often changing. What they need in one moment might not be what they need in another. How do we balance that with community safety and accountability? And I think it's safe to say there isn't one place or one system that has this fully figured out. These are complex and evolving problems requiring complex and multifaceted solutions, but I will stress that a survivor cannot be the one made to feel guilty or responsible for not attempting to stop a person from reoffending or causing harm to someone else. That's a big burden for them to carry, although many do carry that burden. So I have lots of ideas of how we can continue to work on our approach to consent education and accountability, but I will wrap it up by stressing how important it is that we listen to survivors and that we listen to and engage students in this work. So particularly students who've been historically marginalized or underserved by our institutions, these are the ones whose voices have been missing. And really, I think that brings value to the conversation to actually get us towards some solutions. There are so many students doing incredible work, all while being students, which is an amazing feat in itself. It's impressive and they deserve our attention. Also, students are the primary reason that universities exist, although I think sometimes we're guilty of losing sight of this. So I just want to end it there by saying thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing from the remaining panelists and to your questions.
Thank you so much for that, Lyndsay. And as you think about the questions that you're going to ask, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of them, try and think about which panelists you'd like to answer that question as well. So in your question, if you can also include the person who your question is directed towards, that will be really helpful. Our next speaker is Suzie. Over to you, Suzie.
So thank you. It's just been such a thought-provoking panel so far already, and I think this is a really interesting mix of people, because I think it speaks to the layers that we need to bring in together to address gender-based and sexual violence. You know, we need government, we need community, we need law, we need the home, we need each other. There's all of these layers of spaces that we have to address, and communities that we have to address, and also different forms of response. And the area that I work in is, it used to be novel when I started doing the work, but now is quite common, particularly since COVID. One of the things that I found that's been very interesting since COVID's occurred is, in the past, I used to have to convince people sometimes that our online lives and our offline lives are actually integrated, and we can't pull them apart, and we can't say, just turn the internet off, you know, stop texting, stop using Instagram, stop using these things as a way to avoid violence. People now understand that our online lives are utterly integrated into our IRL, in real life lives. And so it's been an interesting shift in the work that I do. Today I'm going to talk to you about a project I'll be working on over the next 2 years called Identifying the Prevalence and Impact of Technology-Facilitated Sexual Violence, with a focus on access to services. What this project is doing is really gathering data on people's experiences with what we're calling technology-facilitated sexual violence, which is a bit of a mouthful of a term, but I'll explain it a bit further on. You can go to the next slide. Research Nova Scotia recently provided us funding. So Julie Blais is a professor here at Dalhousie, and she's the primary investigator of this project. And then myself and Alexa Dodge are working on the project as associates. And Alexa Dodge is someone with a lot of expertise in this area. And then Natalie Rosen's acting as a mentor to us. Next slide, please. So when we talk about technology-facilitated violence, Jane Bailey and Charisma Mathen defined it well when they were looking at technology-facilitated gender-based violence. And it's the spectrum of behaviors that's carried out, at least in some part, through digital communication technologies, including actions that cause physical or psychological harm. So often things that people are familiar with is hate speech online, harassment, cyber stalking, death threats, rape threats, which have shockingly become so normalized. You know, I imagine all of our politicians these days are receiving extraordinary amounts of threats in this way that it's extraordinary and something that really needs to be resisted and pulled back. And I'll share some links later with a paper that I wrote on technology-facilitated gender-based violence in case you want to read a bit more about this topic. Next slide, please. So the areas that we'll be looking at in this study that we'll be doing, where we're going to be looking at both perpetrators and victim survivors. So we'll be looking at online sexual harassment. So this is any unwanted sexual attention that occurs online. So this is people sliding into your DMs without you wanting them to and requesting sexual interaction with you or saying sexual comments. Something that we're seeing more commonly now are unsolicited dick pics that are being sent to people. Or generally, if you're just existing on the internet as a gendered person, you'll often have comments towards you be sexual in nature. We're also looking at gender and sexuality-based harassment. So this is unwelcome, insulting, and degrading comments that specifically refer to an individual's gender. This is particularly intense for transgendered people, where even just identifying as a transgendered person on the internet can bring a lot of vitriol. And so we're really interested in looking at those experiences. We're also going to be looking at cyber stalking and intimate partner violence. So this can range from more advanced forms of cyber stalking, where you're using actual stalkerware, all the way down to just unwanted and repetitive contacts. So maybe someone texting you all the time and not leaving you alone. And the final piece that we'll be looking at is image-based sexual abuse. So there's a wide range of this type of abuse. Sometimes people call some forms of it revenge porn, but that's a really problematic term that blames people for their own victimization, and is often called image-based sexual abuse, or the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, which again is this very mouthy term, but is more specific about what we're addressing. But it also includes things like voyeurism, hidden cameras. Some trends that we're seeing now is that people will surreptitiously record someone or explicitly record someone when they're engaging with them sexually. So, you know, if someone goes down on another person, someone might pull out their camera and film that without them knowing. People also film sexual assaults and sometimes even live stream it. So we're interested in all of these experiences. Next slide. And we really want to look at a variety of equality factors when we're looking at this data collection. So we want to look at the way that gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, indigeneity, race, disability intersect and impact people's experiences of sexual violence in digital spaces. I just recently completed a global study about 18 countries and 18,000 people. And one of the trends that we saw that was across board was on any type of online harm, LGBTQ people were significantly more impacted, much more common experience of this type of violence and much more severe impact of it. So we know that intersecting identity factors are incredibly important to look at. And here in Canada, we've seen things like even being Indigenous or writing about Indigenous stories can bring in a lot of aggressive speech online. So, for example, CBC News had to shut down stories on Indigenous people because the comments were so horrific, regardless of whether it was a positive or negative story about Indigenous people. Just mentioning Indigenous people in a news story would lead to different types of hateful language on there. So we know there's a variety of intersecting factors that come into play when we look at how people are targeted in digital spaces and what that targeting looks like. Next slide. And what we know is this is a very new phenomenon. Unlike the statistics we have on sexual violence, intimate partner violence, we do not have a lot of data on what tech-facilitated violence looks like. So for this project, we want to look at the scope of what this looks like, the magnitude, the consequences, and also propose responses. I think often people will look to the law and they'll say, how can we criminalize this? How can we create civil laws around this? Which I think are important tools that we need to have, but they're not the most essential tools, and they're often the last tool that people will use. Usually people go to community first, they go to their friends and family first, they go to their universities first. And so we're interested also in the types of responses that people want. And part of those responses can also include responses by social media companies. You know, when we think about the power that Facebook and Twitter and Pornhub have in directing content, there's also an important role that we need to think about for tech-based responses or coding safety into our digital spaces. Next slide. So we'll have three main focuses of our study. The first study, which I actually think is going to be very interesting, and there's not a lot of studies even globally, is we'll be looking at perpetrators. So we want to know what's the reasons behind perpetration and how do they feel about it? Because sometimes we'll see forms of violence that are quite normalized. So things like sharing nude photos and creating collections of nude photos of women amongst groups of friends is sometimes seen as a boys be boys playful thing. where actually what we know is that it's a form of abuse and harassment. And so the next study that we'll do is an online study of people who've been victimized and survivors, also to see what their experiences are. And then finally, we're going to do semi-structured interviews with service providers. So this will range from people who work at anti-violence organizations, Indigenous organizations, police victim services, and to talk to them about what services are available and what services are being used here in Nova Scotia. And the study is focused on Nova Scotia specifically. Next slide. And these are some of the data issues that we'll be picking up. What are the rates? What are the adverse outcomes for people who experience this form of violence? One of the things we've seen in previous studies is it leads to silencing. So one of the most common reactions is for people to stop engaging online. So they stop using dating apps, they stop using Twitter, they stop using Instagram. And I think when we're conceptualizing concepts like freedom of expression, often when we talk about freedom of expression, we think about a person's right to say harmful things without actually accounting for the impact of those harmful, that harmful speech on silencing marginalized groups who may no longer feel safe on the internet. And I think all of us have mentioned, not feeling safe in the home, not feeling safe in the streets because of street harassments, not feeling safe in residence, and also not feeling safe on the internet. Where else can you go? Where are these places that we can go for safety? And the internet is another space that we need to consider. Next slide. And service provisions is going to be a major focus of this research. We're really interested in what services exist, what resources people need, and what barriers there may be. We're interested in looking at legal options. Here in Nova Scotia, we have a really interesting legislation, civil legislation, the Intimate Image and Cyber Protection Act, which is actually being reviewed right at this moment. And so there's options to adjust that. And we have criminal law. There's all sorts of laws that we're interested in exploring. And the federal government right now is actually considering proposing a bill that would deal with content moderation on social media sites. And I'll share some links to some more information in case people want to read a bit more. But I think I'm running close to time. So next slide. Yeah, and again, the things we want to look at are just what are the rewards and costs for perpetrators when they're deciding to engage in this type of behavior, and what are the help-seeking behaviors among victims and survivors. Next slide. And of the content that I'm going to share in the chat, there's also an event that I'm doing with the BC campuses that's educating people on what we mean by technology facilitated violence and what some safety planning tips are. So I'll post that on there in case you want to learn a little bit more. And always, if you want to ask more questions after this, my email is there. I'm on Twitter, or you can reach me through my website, and I'm always happy to chat with people. So thank you so much for the time, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A, and we can pass it back to Barb.
Thank you, Suzie, and thank you to all the panelists this evening. I've learned so much, and I know that I have a lot of questions that I have that are going through my head right now, and one of the and I'm going to direct this to you, Crystal John, because one of your comments that you kept making was sound the alarm. And so when we hear that expression, and it was actually powerful, I was thinking that the alarm is not sounded loud enough, and you're right in saying that. So and Lyndsay, you can also follow up after I hear from Crystal. But what do we need to do so people, our institutions and communities can hear the alarm? What do you think we can do?
I think we can write to our MLAs. That's one way that we can write and say, here's what we want. We want community-based services, and we want government and community to work collaboratively. It only works if we have collaboration. I think of things like the domestic violence court program that we brought here to Halifax in 2019 it started, but that work was done over about 18 months prior to it coming to and being an actual program here in Halifax, with collaborations between government, health, education, We all came together and went back out into the community to talk about, what do you need? That's part of the problem, is we often come up with solutions that we think people need, but we don't ask. We need to ask the questions. What do women who are experiencing gender-based violence need? Sometimes we find those answers are really basic. For some, a roof over their head, somewhere they can call home. So I think what we need to do is we need to make some noise about what our governments and our elected officials are doing about this issue that is a men's issue, and kind of flipping the script, because I think for so long we have not really looked at it from that lens. And I think if we flip the script and we look at the cost it has on all of us, we're all affected by it financially, then we can maybe have some impact there.
Thank you, Crystal. And Lyndsay, you talk about the number of institutions you've been on in terms of post-secondary institutions. And I know you've gave some examples of the ones that you've been at, but we still know there's a challenge when it comes to sounding the alarm on the university campuses as well. So what do you think we can do at the university and post-secondary institution level?
Big question. There's lots we can do and lots to be done. In terms of sounding the alarm, I mean, I hope that people have seen some of that already beginning. And like I say, we're talking a lot differently about it now than even we were 10, 15 years ago. But at the same time, I think there's this impression of like, I can't believe we're still having to have these conversations, like how things haven't changed or shifted enough. So, but I think, I'll go back to what I said before, like, I think allowing spaces for people to tell their stories. The stories are what matters. The statistics are important. And data is really important, but I really believe in allowing individuals to share and tell their stories about gender-based violence, and to do so in a way that's meaningful to them. So I have an example that I think is just amazing, which is it's a project called Writing Activism, and it came out of two students that worked at St. FX. So just to highlight them again once more, but in a positive way, these two students created a resource that allowed survivors to submit their stories and their art and their media about sexualized violence. And I know they're working on getting that project published. So I think that's a great example of people mobilizing to tell stories and share the stories of survivors. But on the flip side of that, we have to be willing to listen. And I know that sometimes the stories get told in a way that makes a lot of us who work on university campuses uncomfortable. So that might mean someone posting something on social media in a very public way. And I know it kind of makes a lot of us like, oh no, like how, that's not what we want, but it's another way of sharing the story. So I think we need to not sort of bristle or get alarmed when someone is doing that, because that's their way of doing it. And we have to listen and we have to kind of take that feedback. So I think the alarm has been sounded, but I think now we're at the stage where it's a bit more about listening. And I'm connected to a couple different networks that are folks doing this work on campuses across Canada. And I do think there's some incredible work happening and taking place, and I won't get into it too much now, but we are trying, and I think there's a lot of effort being made, but we've got a long way to go. And so I think it's just more events like this, more opportunities to share stories and to listen to those stories.
Thank you, Lyndsay. I'm just going to pull you in for a minute, Lisa. I heard Crystal talk about the fact that we need to engage with our MLAs more, write letters. And you said yourself that before you were an MLA, you didn't engage as much with your own MLA. So what suggestions can you give in terms of what can the MLAs do if we were to communicate with them in some of our letters of our needs to, respond to gender-based violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, I also want to demystify that people sometimes feel like maybe they have to be ready to write a beautiful opus of something when they're writing to elected officials and that sort of thing, that they have to work really hard. And I think just to for people to know that it's an accessible process and that they should, sort of just, it doesn't have to be perfect. So that's the first thing. Or you can give us a call, or you can send us a little video. So first of all, I think lowering the barriers. I do know that sometimes MLAs and other elected officials don't reply. So I know that those folks are out there, but there's lots of us who will. So I think it's also important to, not to get discouraged. So I think in terms of like so I'm an opposition MLA in a majority government. So my experience of being an MLA is based on that. But, I still think there's lots I can do. Like I said, when we hear from constituents, so, like we get lots of letters and emails about housing, people struggling with housing, and our constituency assistants can usually help people. So we, so that's sort of an individual remedy, but then we're also talking about this at caucus, and then maybe the critic for that area will then be able to say, I'm going to bring this up with the minister. So I think, trying to reflect systemically. We met as a caucus today with like the United Way, for instance. So because obviously folks in community are seeing things happen, and we're hearing about things. So I think it's an important way to raise an issue and start getting the issue. Like if we wanted to sound the alarm, like to get the issue being talked about at the legislature, in the legislature, even as opposition MLAs, we have the chance to table petitions, ask question period questions, and hold the government to account. At the same time, we can try and work with government, and that's something that I'm doing quite a bit of in the critic areas that you talked about, just to meet with ministers and say, I've been out talking to folks too. This is what I've heard. So what are you hearing? What are you going to do about it? So I think I think that's a lot of what, I think keeping us in the loop is really helpful. And like I said, not every MLA is always super responsive, but I don't mind. I do get a lot of inquiries, for instance, as the only 2S LGBTQ plus out person. And so I get referrals from other MLAs, or folks just like they want to contact me because it's going to be more comfortable. So it's okay to also have our allies and to reach out to them. So I guess that's sort of the start of my answer.
Thank you, Lisa. Suzie, I'm going to pull you into the conversation a little bit, especially because if you think about COVID and the past 2 years, and Crystal made mention of that, a lot of it has been online, even more so than usual. And I'm sure within that 2 years, and I don't know how long your research project has started, I'm sure within that 2 years, there has been more of an increase in some of the violence that you're talking about online. I'm not sure if within what you're gathering, and you talked about gathering information on race and identity and so forth, are you also looking at it based on age and gender? And can you just tell me a little bit more about some of that research that you're doing?
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm happy to. So we're just at the beginning of the research project. So we've just recently got the funding announced. So we actually haven't done it. So this is one of the things that we're doing. We're thinking about right now in the next few months as we get the project going, which will probably be in the summer. We're going to start thinking about like what are the identity factors that we want to look at. And so the research that I've been doing, as an academic through my PhD, we've seen certain trends of the types of people who are targeted, the ways that they're targeted. And so we're going to rely a lot on previous existing data that's mostly from outside of Canada. So a lot of the data is coming out of Australia, it's coming out of the United States, it's coming out of the UK. And so we're going to look at projects that have already been done around this and to see what trends exist there, to see what we should be trying to look for here in Canada. And so we are hoping to have a fairly dynamic level of identity choices that people will be able to select, so that we'll be able to kind of cross-populate our data to see, who is being affected. And I think that there are major issues when it comes to things like generational divides. When we think about age, when we think about some types of forms of gender-based abuse that are more common with older women are romance scams, where people are targeting, separated older women, creating a romantic relationship with them over years, sometimes months, and then creating some sort of false narrative around a sick kid or some desperate need for money. And many older women had a large amount of their income stolen from them in these ways. You know, where if we think of not so much the younger generation anymore, I think that often we talk about young people being saturated by the internet, but I think that group of people is getting older and older and older. But what we're thinking about now that I think is difficult when it comes to sexual experiences and gender-based violence is we're not really sure how to navigate sex on the internet. You know, and it's a part of healthy sexual expression, you know, but some of the communication around sexual experiences on the internet is very demonizing, saying, you know, if you film yourself in the same way that if you wear a short skirt to a bar that you deserve it, you know, that if you film yourself sexually, if you engage sexually in digital spaces, even if you're unaware of being recorded. So say if you're on Zoom and engaging in sexual activity and someone records you without consent, there's this victim blaming that's going on. And so I think we have a lot of work to do when it comes to navigating what's the boundary between healthy sexual expression and non-healthy sexual abuse in digital spaces. And so I think there's a major education piece that we have, especially amongst, if we can get to young people as soon as possible, but there's a major, we're in this digital revolution, and many of us who have expertise in gender-based violence don't know much about tech and are struggling when people are coming and saying, I'm used to being in a transition house where I know what to say, I know how to safety plan around abusive, violent partners, but I don't know how to safety plan around stalkerware. I don't know how to safety plan around people distributing my nude images all over the internet without my consent. So I think we do have generational issues that are coming in here that we'll need to address. But yeah, it's a fairly complex topic to figure out exactly what the pinpoints are going to be.
That's really great. You've raised a lot of other questions, and I know, you know, my couple of 5 minutes in between Zoom meetings that I had last night, I saw an indication of a gentleman who was actually charged and convicted for falsifying his worth on a dating site. And so he made images of himself in this exclusive, expensive airport and on a plane, and really, you know, made himself sound really rich and wealthy, and was looking for women who were rich and wealthy and would swindle money from them for that purpose. And so you're creating a lot of areas that we need to be more aware of that we never had to think about before, right? So very interesting. I love the fact that the collection of race-based data and the fact that it doesn't exist came up and doesn't exist to the level that it needs to exist. And I know that at Dalhousie, we're trying to do a better job of race-based data collection, and we're trying to do a better job of disaggregating that data. We know that it's challenging to create that safety net for people to self-identify, especially around race. So Crystal, what suggestions would you have that we could encourage more people to self-identify, and why do you think it's important to collect race-based data?
I think ways that we can encourage people is by going into our communities. In the African, Nova Scotian and Black communities, we are very much based around our community. So our churches, we need to kind of engage more around spaces where women are, having our local social workers and professionals coming into the community to collect that data, because I know that, I mean, I'm familiar with a lot of spaces in Nova Scotia and Halifax and feel very comfortable walking into those spaces. But I know that a lot of Black women do not, because when they look around, they don't see themselves. So if I identify on a form that I am Black, African Nova Scotian, I then start to go, oh, how's that going to affect me? They're not going to hire me. Oh, they're going to check my name out to see if I have any criminal, like there's so much negative that's related to that because of our history of racism. And so we are not, even myself, I'm always very selective where I choose to identify, because not all safe spaces are safe for identification. And sorry, Bob, what was the second part of your question?
Why do you see the importance of collecting it?
Because we matter. I mean, it's as simple as because we matter. And if you are telling me that you want to help me and you want to provide services for me, and yet you don't know what my needs are because you don't know what my health status is. You don't know my family history. You don't know what is more prevalent. I mean, you know, because you probably see more Black women who are have diabetes or this, but really specifically we matter. And I cannot imagine why, when you matter in a society, we're not included, which is often, you know, at a lot of the tables that I sit at with government, I always say, I don't want to come into this as an afterthought. If I'm not there from the beginning, it means that you didn't think about me, that after you decided what you were going to do and how you were going to develop the program and or what services you're going to provide, you thought, oh, I forgot about. And so we need to see more of us at the table. We are a fast growing educational, women are growing very quickly in education. We are outnumbering men in a lot of spaces where we are educating. We are educating ourselves in higher education. There are lots of PhDs. So we have the resources out there. We need to use those resources to empower other women to come forward. So that's why, because we matter.
Thank you, Crystal. And I'm going to ask Lisa, I'm going to pull you in here because you talked about the fact that our 2S LGBTQ plus population, particularly our youth, are extremely vulnerable when it comes to gender-based violence. And similarly, how important is it to collect data? And when we know that the government isn't collecting data specific to SOGI or to 2S LGBTQ, how can we make that also important, that we collect data on what's happening to that community? It's often not included in our data collection.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, and just to sort of make the point and maybe link with the last question that I answered, you know, I am both disappointed and appalled, and have shared that with the PC government, that, you know, nowhere in their platform, nowhere in the speech from the throne or mandate letters, no one mentioned 2S LGBTQ plus folks. So there's nothing. There's no minister responsible. There's no department responsible. There's no strategy. So it's actually just completely silent. And so that's a great place to start. I mean, we're just not even included as part of the conversation. So when, you know, if governments don't, you know, identify a mandate, identify priorities for different communities, then I think that's really an important starting point too. And would that be easier if we had more data? Potentially. I guess I really liked what Crystal said in terms of starting with community, and I also, you know, I noted that a couple of us talked about data and understanding, and also I think a couple of us also talked about, you know, understanding what works. So that sort of whole bit about data and evaluation and, you know, what outcomes we're getting. And I think the challenge is, you know, how do we do that type of work, kind of, you know, like in real time, in ways that are participatory and respectful of folks? How do you, how do you make data collection and analysis part of, and, you know, empowering or liberating, or part of the justice-seeking process? And I think, you know, I kind of rushed through the description of that project that we did, but I think that was really a powerful piece for me. Was, you know, we had, just young people, you know, joining from difficult, challenging circumstances, but who were unconnected, sometimes to other, you know, queer folks or queer communities. And so to really have a chance to think about how they reflected in their, you know, their discussion group or what have you, about their own experience, but then to hear what was also being said across the country was, I think, really quite powerful. So I think looking for those opportunities, because you know, my concern about calling for data and evaluation is that just like slows everything down, right? Like it just like everything grinds to a halt because we have to get the data. And so how, you know, what's good enough? How can we do it quickly? And, you know, and linking between academic and government, you know, often academic timelines are not government timelines. So, and so we really need to sort of figure out how to meet in the middle and get the information out there when we can. But like I said, like right now in the Nova Scotia government, if you wanted to present a study on the health of 2S LGBTQ plus folks, I think the Minister of Health would see you, but she has no mandate for that.
Thank you. What that's telling me is that we all need to sort of advocate for a number of populations that have been marginalized from different areas of our government, including health and looking at our 2S LGBTQ community. So thank you for that. This is a question that you all can engage in, but I'm going to first throw it at Lyndsay in terms of hearing the stories and the work that you're doing and the fact that all you are frontline workers to a degree in terms of either doing the research or meeting with community. So the fact that you have to sit and listen or read and engage in some of this research on a regular basis, what do you do to take care of yourself? How do you manage it?
Well, it's a great question and one that gets talked about a lot in some of the groups that I'm a part of, some of the other frontline sexualized violence workers. And, there's a lot of discussions around self-care, and you kind of colloquially will hear people, have a bubble bath and, buy yourself a treat. And it's like, we need to do stuff that's a bit more, that stuff is important, don't get me wrong, but we need to be a bit more meaningful in our care. And I would actually think about it less as self-care and more as community care. And how can we draw upon our communities to kind of, do some of that care for each other. So I think for me, what I have found really valuable, a couple different things, is that I need to have that network and that connection of people that I can just call or reach out to and be like, obviously with no information being shared, but just be like, I'm dealing with a really challenging case and I just need to talk to someone about it. Or, knowing that I have an office of supportive people that I can kind of pull aside at the end of the day and just be like, I'm struggling and could use some assistance, but also being careful not to dump trauma on other people either, being respectful of not sort of saying, well, I'm traumatized by what I just heard, so somebody else needs to be too, so being cautious of that. And one of the things that I have done, and it's part of the reason why I returned to Dal after having been away for a couple years and living through this pandemic, has made me be a lot more aware of and protective of my personal time away from work. And I just think that capitalism has completely changed, not changed, it's been in existence forever, but has caused me to think that I have to work all the time and be the best and climb up the ladder in student affairs. And once I started to do that, I just realized that it's not what I wanted. So even though I'm doing very valuable and important work on campus, I have to have boundaries and I need to be able to step away from that work. And that's why I play roller derby and why I talk about it so much, because it's completely unrelated to anything I do professionally. But it's the best thing I've ever done for myself. And, I'm an active person and I really try to protect that personal time. And there was an article that came out pre-pandemic, so at least 3 years ago, I'd say, that was talking about how participating in activities or hobbies is actually a way to dismantle sort of the capitalistic way of being, and that, it shouldn't always be about the hustle, that we need to protect our time. And so that's one of the ways that I take care of myself, is by being protective of my time that's not work related, and prioritizing that. And that does, I have to fight this all the time. That does not make me selfish or, not capable and not good at what I do. It just means that I'm going to be better at what I do because I take care of myself and my time.
That's a good response. I'm going to ask Crystal to respond to that same question. Then I have a different question for you, Lisa and Suzie. So Crystal, how do you take care of yourself when you're hearing these stories?
I fill my plate, my bank, my personal self up with friends, family. I have taken up journaling. And so I do this thing called bullet journaling, and it has brought out in me a creative space. I didn't know I was this creative. And so it's, it's interesting. And some nights I just sit down and I doodle and I create little spaces and I do lots of stuff. And I think one of the things I like to do is, and so I manage a homeless shelter. And so I got home last night at 7:30. Normally I get home at 5. I got home about 7:30, 8 o'clock. And I thought something came on and it said it's Tuesday. And I was like, it's only Tuesday. So some of the things that I experience and walk with women through on a daily basis have the tendency to really drain. So I come home, I do 30 minutes of nothing. I try to have no lights on. My daughter's kind of piddling in the background, and I just like to sit. Because if we don't take the time to unravel and unwind from the busyness, and especially if you are, as I assume most of the women on this panel are, women who are givers. So we go and we give and we take care of everybody and we make sure everybody's got food and comfort and all of these things. And often we're the last one, you know, it's like that I'm headed out to bed at 11 o'clock and I get there by 12 because I have to wash the dishes and make the lunch, and then I walk by the bathroom and that's untidy. So I tidy that up a little bit, and then I think, oh, I better prepare this for tomorrow. And then I get to my room and I'm like, oh, I forgot to do this. So you know, we're always constantly going. And I think often enough we don't stop and enjoy our friends and our families. Through this pandemic, I have been online with my friends. We've had wine parties, we've had talk parties, we've just, you know, watched movies in our separate spaces and talked about it online. So it's really, really important. And I think for me as well, that meditation piece, just being able to quiet our minds and sit in stillness. And we don't do that often enough, for sure. So those are some of the things that I do. And, you know, as a social worker, that is one of the things that they said in the very beginning. Make sure you're doing self-care. Make sure you're doing self-care. But when you are a giver, you forget to give to yourself. And so I just try to really make that a priority, and buy yourself roses. Absolutely. People go, I go to Costco and I get these big bunches of roses and people go, oh, who are those for? And I'm like, me? It's like, oh, was I supposed to buy them for somebody else? So yeah, I think we just need to be easy and treat ourselves because we do give so much.
Thank you. And this next question will be both for Lisa and Suzie. And Lisa, I'm going to throw it at you first. For me, when I saw that PowerPoint slide of what was happening in Ottawa with the folks with the sign and the person skating around the park, it hurt me. And the reason why it hurt me so much is because I was thinking there could be people that are skating there that identify as 2S LGBTQ. And they're in the midst of hate. They're in the midst of homophobic people. And there's nothing they can do about that. And they're in such a vulnerable state. And so my question, after I deal with all that pain that I'm experiencing myself, is we also heard about how some school boards in Ontario were trying to stop us, or have been successful, and not having the discussion of sexual health in some of their schools because they believe it's too early for kids to learn about sexual health. How do you feel about education on GBV? Do you think that gender-based violence is adequate in early childhood? Should we be introducing gender-based violence in our school system at an early age in early childhood development? Or are we waiting too long to introduce the idea of gender-based violence?
I mean, I think, you know, I think there's a lot of conversations that we can have earlier. So I think around, you know, people's bodily autonomy and their rights and all that sort of work, you know, and certainly, you know, I saw that through my own, you know, parenting. So I have a 15-year-old and an 18-year-old now. So, you know, not really that long ago, you know, we were in the thick of it. And, you know, I absolutely remember, you know, fighting at the PTA to have the youth project come in and do some presentations to classes and actually not winning that fight. Like I fought that for months. And people were like, well, you know, if it was junior high, maybe, but, you know, no, it's too young. So like just kind of that sort of fascinating bit. But, you know, I think there are some really good examples of programs that have been developed. So, you know, and I think different young people need different things in different ways, and you know it needs to be culturally relevant and that sort of thing. But you know, I was really impressed. So my daughter started at Sparks, and you know they have discussions in Sparks at age 5 when she's in primary around December 6th. But it's about being a good friend, right? And it's about, you know, your like how you show you care someone, you know, if someone does something you don't like, what do you do? Like, and those sort of building blocks that, you know, I think that is a lot of the important information. But I also think, you know, I guess I was raised by a hippie nurse mom, so I knew all about stuff really early on, and so did my own children. And I think it's really important. It makes it, you know, making things forbidden or mysterious serves no one. So, and then I think around sexual orientation and gender identity, I mean, you know, I think the science shows that young people across the gender spectrum identify their gender before the age of 5. And so how can we support those young people to be comfortable in that and not have to, you know, sort of abandon it due to societal pressure?
And similarly, I'm thinking of it for you, Suzie. We know that computers are in our school system very early. We also know they're in our homes very early. We also know it's very easy to type a word in the Google engine, and it will throw up what you want. And you don't have to be 20, 19, 16, or 15 to type in certain words and get images. So what age should we start talking to our children about the internet, the computer use, the misuse, what's on there? Because we know we've heard of some young people who will go into a site, think they're in a good site. Next thing you know, there's a pornography video popping up on that site, and they're all of a sudden like, I didn't get it. I don't know how that happened. How do we educate people in the internet world? And when should we?
Well, I think it's such a great question, you know, and I think similarly to what Lisa was saying, you know, when we're thinking about healthy behaviors online, when we're thinking about anti-violence, when we're thinking about, you know, healthy sexual behaviors, there's age-appropriate education at all times, you know, and often it's about how do you manage aggression? Like, how do you manage feelings of disappointment? How do you manage when someone rejects you? You know, and what do you do? You know, do you lash out in physical violence? Do you write something cruel about them on the internet? Do you block and delete, which I think is something that's really tough for young people, that, you know, the way that they express friendship is now concrete in a way that it didn't used to be before. It's numerical in how many friends they have and how many followers they have. And I think when it comes to online healthy behaviors, that's something that can be integrated with many normal forms of healthy behavior education. But I do think one of the differences that a lot of parents are not used to because they didn't have that experience themselves is what you can gain access to as a young person on the internet. You know, and what we're seeing in Ottawa, what we're seeing in a lot of those spaces, you know, that's largely because of groups of people getting together on the internet and sharing very hateful messages and finding solidarity amongst each other and amplifying those messages amongst each other. And some of the ways that our social media companies are structured, they amplify negative content because it gets a lot of clicks and it gets a lot of likes and it gets a lot of attention. So talking to people, young people, about what type of content it is that they engage with. And I think when it comes to pornography, regardless of people's perspective on whether pornography is inherently harmful or whether pornography is inherently positive, what we do know about pornography is it's sexual fantasy and it's not sexual reality. And what we see is that a lot of young people are learning about sexual experiences through pornography in a way that they never used to. And they're gaining access even unintentionally at quite young ages. You know, 10, 11 years old is usually about the time when a person will first be exposed to some pornography, either someone showing it or they come across it on the internet. And when you think about some of the explicit pornography that's out there, you know, when we were, you know, when I think of myself as a young person, you know, I was probably 13 or 14 when the internet came out, but we didn't have the same type of access. But we learned about sexuality and bad habits through romantic movies that, you know, taught us false lies about what sex and romance were. But now that a lot of young people are learning through pornography, which is very male dominated, it's often relying on racist stereotypes. It provides myths around what sexual pleasure looks like. These are things that we need to be talking about to people quite young. And I think younger than we probably would normally want to in a sex education program, just because of the reality that the internet exists and they can get access to age inappropriate content much earlier than we would have seen in non-internet eras. But I agree, as young as possible, we need to be talking about compassion, consent, communication, and especially in the digital era, when the things that they write online and the way that they communicate online create digital footprints, and they're being tracked and they're being documented in a way that we used to be able to have childhoods that we could leave behind. And now there's a track record of your childhood, and people can go back to the things you've said and done in your childhood and pull those up to judge you later on in life and as an adult in some ways that can be unfair and problematic. But we need to talk to young people about that quite young.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much. I know that we're running out of time, and it's been a great discussion. I just have another question that I want to throw out there. But just before I do that, Suzie, I also want to make the comment that it was fantastic seeing the push that Facebook had around getting rid of some of the images they have of what is this perfect female, because we knew that some of our women, or women, those who identified as women, were actually hurting themselves to make these images that weren't themselves. So we need to also make sure that our media is being accountable to the images they're showing as well to young people. But I want to flip the switch a little, and I know that that Lyndsay talked about it a little bit, and as did Crystal. And Crystal, you talked about the clinic that Robert Wright has that supports people who have created or have done the harm to individuals. And we didn't really talk about that population much tonight in terms of how can we support those who have caused the harm around gender-based violence. Any suggestions on that for me? I'll go to Crystal and then Lyndsay.
I think we need to talk to the young men in our lives, have conversations about how they are interacting with others. Often we don't think about, the young men are, they're doing all the things that they should be doing that men do, but some of that behavior feeds into that they have this power over women, that there are things that they are allowed to do that society thinks is okay for them to do. I think we need to bring them into conversations, and we need to start young. Like, let's have these conversations with our young men about what does it look like? I mean, how many of our young men have probably never taken someone out on a date? Like, let's teach them how to act. Let's teach them what's inappropriate. I mean, if we ask them what consent means, they were like, well, why would we need consent if we're both feeling the same thing? They don't think to ask the questions. And I think it's really important that we support these community-based grassroots organizations who are doing the work. They are working with these men. They are doing the best that they can. Often, one of the things that always gets my back up is that in our community, the Black and African Nova Scotian community, projects that we do that are government funded are 4-year projects. Because when we get to 5 years, we start to get some good data that you can't ignore. When you get to a 10-year project, you can't ignore the data that's in that project, the research that comes out of it. And so when we're accepting these projects, we need to think about, is this going to be something that we're doing just for the government to look good? Well, we funded, I think about creating communities of care. Great program, but it was 4 years. I feel like that's deliberate. Because at 5 years, you start to dig into what the root of these problems are. And so I think we need to rally around small organizations that are really trying to make a difference in the lives of men. We cannot have this conversation. We cannot move forward without them. And so we need to be embracing and including them in the conversations.
Barb, I'm going to answer this question in less than a minute.
Okay.
So I was really lucky to be part of work being done at a federal level with the Courage to Act project, which is a national initiative to address gender-based violence on post-secondary campuses. And so the group that I was a part of was actually tasked with looking at how do we work with people who caused harm? What does that mean and why is it important? So that toolkit that we created was recently published, so you can find it at courage2act.ca under the Knowledge Center. And so in that toolkit, we looked at sort of what does a typical process look like when we're addressing sexual violence on campuses or gender-based violence on campuses, and how do we work with the person who caused the harm? And the reason why it's important to do that, and the reason why I believe that's survivor-centered, is because most of these people are going to continue to exist after the process is over. We can't throw them in jail. They're not often going to jail or prison. They're going to exist in communities. They're going to move on to another institution potentially. They're going to go back to their families, back to their communities. And if we haven't done anything to actually address the harm and look at, true accountability, then we're sending them back out to continue to cause that harm. So we need to do a better job working with people who caused harm. It's a survivor-centered way of sort of working with them. And we also know that a lot of people who cause harm have been harmed. And so I think that trauma-informed practice needs to be applied to everybody that we're working with, particularly if they're going to continue to be a member of our community, which many of them do. So anyway, that was maybe more than a minute, but courage2act.ca.
Thank you. Thank you again for just participating this evening. I could go on and on about asking questions, but it's been a great discussion. I know it's going to be an excellent learning tool for anyone who comes back onto our site and visits it and uses it in their classroom. This is a topic that needs to be talked about. It's a topic that we often hide from, but it's a topic that needs to be discussed. And I agree, it needs to be discussed at a young age for all people. Because we don't know who's creating that harm in some cases, or who might create the harm and who might be on the other end receiving that harm. So it's important to have these conversations. And again, I appreciate you taking the time tonight. I'm now going to turn it back over to Dr. Teresa Rajak-Talley.
Thank you, Babs. I want to say thank you to the panelists. I know, like me, you had a very long day, and like the attendees, and had several events going on and have experienced webinar trauma, but yet I feel, and here we are at the end of the day, discussing a very traumatic, very disturbing, and very persistent issue. But I have to let you know that I have gotten some level of comfort being in your presence. And this is the kind of support that we are talking about. I want to thank you for not just being on the panel, but for the difficult work that you do, and for your persistence, your resilience, and your commitment. And let's all gain strength from that, and I want to commit to you that we will keep sounding the alarm at Dalhousie. We will use this recording as an educational tool and push it as far as we could and as wide as we could, because people need to hear what you had to say tonight. Each one of you contributed such important, meaningful, challenging, questionable points that we need to have this conversation. So thank you, both personally and professionally, for being with us this evening. I want to thank the attendees because you too had competing events and our webinar traumatized. I want to thank the people behind the scenes, April, Amina, James, and Riel. And of course, I want to thank my co-host, who is supposed to be in training, but I think we can all agree is a pro at this. So on that happy note, I want us to remain committed and together. We will have you back to report on your research, your experiences, and so on. And know that you have support from our Office of Equity and Inclusion, Human Rights and Equity Services, and Community Engagement. So again, thank you. And we do have a slide up with some resources for people in case they need to find this information. And we will post this recording on our website. Thank you and good night.